Hey, what's up guys? David Johnston here, and in this video I want to share some tips on things you may want to consider or know before you invest and buy new landscape photography lenses. That's coming up. Hey, what's up guys, and welcome into the video where we're going to be discussing some of the things that you may want to consider whenever you are buying new lenses for landscape photography. And photography gear is one of the biggest things that you can invest in, obviously, because it's the tools that we use as photographers to create the images that are in our style, that's in our creative vision of what we want to photograph. So it's important to choose the right one. And I understand that sometimes buying a new lens or investing in new gear can cause a little bit of anxiety. Like, what do you buy? What if I buy the wrong kind of lens? I've totally been there so many times, and I've really landed on some good gear that I've found. This is a Rokinon 12mm, which I'm going to be talking about in a second. And this is a Sony 70-200 f4. I'm a Sony E-mount shooter. So that's one of the things that you need to consider when you are buying a lens is, are you buying for APS-C? Are you buying for full frame? Whether you shoot APS-C or full frame, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can still create great images with either one. It's just that some of the lenses, like this Rokinon 12mm, is for APS-C camera bodies. Now, that means that if you put this 12mm lens on a full frame body, you're gonna get like a weird shadowing circle on the edges of your frame. So you need to be aware of those things before you invest. But like some of the gear, some of the lenses that you are investing in, that you are looking at, like, what should you be looking for? And a lot of people say like the fastest lenses or the widest lenses are technically the best. And I don't necessarily agree or subscribe to that thought, because like I usually buy the cheaper versions of gear, which is like f4 to 5.6, 5.6 to 6.5, something like that. And I'll invest in those lenses if they have good reviews. So for example, this Sony 70-200 is an f4 because it's a little bit lighter than the f2.8 and it's significantly cheaper. And honestly, for landscape photography, like, how often are you actually going to f2.8 if you had it? I understand there are certain situations, if you're doing like detail shots and blurring out the backgrounds of things, you can still do a pretty good job of that with an f4. It's just that you're not going to get as blurred of a background. Honestly, that's literally like 3% of what I'm doing as a landscape photographer. Typically with this lens, I'm shooting at something like f8, f11, f14, and working with it that way. So why should I spend more money to get a wider aperture, a faster lens, a heavier lens, but I'm only using that ability 3% of the time? The investment doesn't make too much sense. But we've talked about telephoto lenses. What about wide angle lenses? Wide angle lenses are a little bit similar. This is an f2, but it's also an off-brand lens, I guess you could say. Even though Rokinon makes some really good lenses, you need to be aware of, like, should you go name brand? Like if I'm shooting on Sony, should I get a Sony wide angle? Well, the difference in price there, especially for this lens versus like the best APS-C wide angle lens that I could get for this Sony body, is, you know, almost $1,000. So what I want to invest in this, which is a prime lens, I can't zoom, I have a wider aperture than the other one does, but it's significantly cheaper, and that's one of the things that I invested in. But I was sure to read all reviews. You can also test lenses before you buy them for a couple days, which is a great idea. I think it's something I do before I buy a lens. You can do that with lens rentals. I'll post a link below for 15% off that they gave me that you guys can use if you want to rent a lens before you buy and try it out that way. But when I invest in a wide angle lens, I do typically look at wider apertures, and that's different than this because with a wide angle, that's what I'm typically shooting night photography with as well. So I'm not only going out and shooting waterfalls or like epic sunrises and sunsets, What I'm doing with this a lot of the times is shooting night photography as well, which does take up a considerable amount of the things that I'm photographing. So I do want a wider aperture here. Typically, if I'm shooting night photography, I'm going like f2.8 to f2. Even there are some that are f1.8. The wider, the better, because the more light you're able to collect in that lens. Not only that, you can reduce the amount of space in your bag, because with this lens you're shooting night and day photography. It's my go-to for wide-angle lenses, and it's very small, takes up not a lot of room in my bag. I have a lot of cash left over for actually going places and using these lenses. So thinking about what you're going to use the lens for and what you need within the lens in terms of technology. Do you need a wider aperture? Do you need a smaller aperture? You might be going out and photographing something that has a lot of blurred background and that's like your style, and you need to go to the 2.8 instead of the 4. So that's totally cool. It's in terms of what you are shooting, and I think a lot of photographers need to think very strategically about the investments that they're making with their gear. What are you shooting? What are you using most? What are you not? How can you save on investment? Not go into debt buying gear. That's one of the biggest things. Like, do not buy a piece of gear that's going to put you in debt. That's setting yourself up for failure and not allowing yourself to be free whenever you do finally get that piece of gear in the mail, purchase it, bring it in. Now you have nowhere to go to use it to shoot because you're already in debt with the piece of gear that you're using. So thinking about all these things before you get into the field. What are you using your lens for? What are you typically shooting for your photography style? What is the lens going to allow you to do? How can I save cash, and how can I save space and weight in my bag are typically the 5 things that I'm looking at whenever I'm purchasing gear and whenever I'm looking to invest in a new piece of gear for landscape photography.